Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to help you get your Week 15 lineup set. It is the start of the fantasy football playoffs in most leagues. That changes the lineup calculations a bit. It does also, Jared, make it easier to overthink everything, and we kind of have to find the balance between those. It's ultimately the same process of setting your best lineup for the week, but other weeks during the season, especially earlier in the year, we can take chances. We know we can kind of make up for it if we have a bad week. At this point, a bad week means that's it for most of us. So that does change the decisions a little bit. I think the key is to incorporate that change without making it make you second guess every single decision and overplaying the things that really don't matter as much as you make yourself think they do.
I think that's the best advice. Don't second guess this stuff. Don't overthink this stuff. Like your team is still alive. That means your roster is good enough and you've played well enough so far this season to get to this point. I mean, the goal is still the same, right? You're trying to win this week, and you've obviously done a good job doing that to get to this point. So I would just say, for the most part, keep doing what you've been doing to get here.
Now, we will talk about some of the intricacies within that going forward, but that's the basis. Don't overthink it, but make sure you're thinking. Now, one of the key things to setting our lineups this week is sorting through a bunch of pretty impactful injury situations. So we're going to start there. And Kenneth Walker's first up on the list because he missed last week's game with a calf injury. That, of course, paved the way for Zach Charbonnet to be a workhorse, to deliver huge fantasy points. So everybody who has Charbonnet, everybody who has Kenneth Walker is waiting to see what's going to happen with Walker. Mike McDonald, the head coach, said Wednesday that tests indicated no significant injury to the calf. He called Ken Walker day to day. So that means, of course, we're going to have to watch him throughout the week. Did not practice Wednesday. So obviously that's not a good start unless you're a Charbonnet owner and not a Walker owner.
Yeah, and that's a Sunday night game too, which will make it even trickier if Walker ends up as a game time decision. My vibes as of now, as of Thursday morning, without even seeing Thursday's practice report yet, but my vibes are that Kenneth Walker is not going to play this week. Just the fact that he had to undergo those additional tests early this week. McDonald also said that Walker could play on Sunday night without practicing at all. So he has a shot still. My guess as of now is that Walker is not going to play. If you're a Walker owner, I would plan on not having him at this point. And then, of course, Charbonnet will be a top 15 running back, if not a top 10 running back, if Walker ends up missing this game.
By the way, Terry Bradshaw unironically called him Cabernet during the Sunday broadcast.
I heard that.
And it's one of those things where you're like, was he joking? He absolutely was not joking.
No.
He just said his name was Cabernet. Moving on, though, Breece Hall, another running back that did not play last week. His coach, Jeff Ulbrich, said this week that Hall is still struggling a bit with that knee injury, quote, not improving as much as he'd like. He also said that they would shut him down if it were the kind of injury that could threaten his future, and that they're not at that point right now. On the other hand, though, there's really no reason for a 3-10 Jets team to push Breece Hall, even if he's just a little bit uncertain on that knee, because that can, then lead to compensatory issues. And, there's just no reason to risk anything with him. So it's another one we're going to have to watch this week, but I'd have to guess that Breece Hall doesn't play this week. And then that, of course, raises the question of what you do with the Jets backfield, which probably could not have been more split than it was last week.
Yeah, that's my guess too, is that Breece Hall does not play this week. I hope he doesn't play this week. He's not at 100%. There's no reason he should be playing for this Jets team that is now officially eliminated from the playoff picture. Braylon Allen, Isaiah Davis, very equal in snaps, pass routes. The opportunities were exactly even last week, 16 for both guys. Braylon Allen led 11-10 in carries, but Isaiah Davis edged Allen 6-5 in targets. So they sit pretty close in our week 15 running back rankings. The fact that it's a split backfield kind of hurts both guys. It is a good spot, though, for the backfield. The Jets are favored in this game against the Jags by 3.5 points. Jacksonville 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back. I prefer Allen. He got the start last week. He did play a few more snaps than Isaiah Davis, did run a few more routes than Isaiah Davis. If you're picking between the two, I'd go Braylon Allen. But I think they're both in play as like RB3s or flexes because of this matchup.
Just to compare them further, Braylon Allen was drafted earlier by the same team, so he was the better prospect. Both rookies, so equal footing in terms of experience. And we've seen more of Braylon Allen over the course of the season. So if you're deciding between those guys on the same team, I agree. I would play Braylon Allen. It's always frustrating when we get a split backfield like this. It's at least a good spot where they are both usable. Obviously, it depends on what else you have to choose from. Bucky Irving did play last week, barely though. He went no practice limited leading up to the weekend, was questionable, played, made it through 10 snaps before leaving that game. another DNP to start the practice week this week. So what are we doing with Bucky Irving besides waiting and watching?
This is probably the toughest call of the week for me among these injured running backs. It's back tightness Bucky Irving's dealing with, according to Todd Bowles. And Bowles basically said earlier this week that they're just going to have to see how Irving progresses throughout the week and basically how he's feeling by the weekend before determining whether he can play. Now, like if the back loosens up, like I would assume Bucky Irving could play his usual role in this one. And we saw the upside, a few times a couple of weeks back of what a fully healthy Bucky Irving can do. This matchup against the Chargers are 7th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. A lot of that's because they just haven't given up many touchdowns to the position. They've just, they haven't given up many points in general this year. But the Chargers are mid-pack and run defense DVOA. They're allowing 4.5 yards per carry to running back. So it's a doable matchup for the Bucs ground games. I could see Irving finishing as a top 20 running back this week if he's fully healthy. But one, we're not going to know if he's playing even until later this week. And then if he does play, there's a chance we get what happened this past week where, he plays, the back gives him an issue in game, then he has to exit again. So really tough call. Can't say for sure at this point of the week, but I think regardless, there's going to be elevated risk with Bucky Irving. So maybe this is a case where if you have another good option and it's playoff time at this point, it's, win or go home. Maybe if there's a similar option, I'd probably lean against playing Irving this week just because of the downside.
Yeah, we're going to have to watch not only the official status of Bucky Irving at the end of the week, but also the specific reports. We will at least have last week as context where, they can, I hope, ask the coaches, hey, is this different than last week? Is he feeling better than he was last Sunday? What are the chances that we get the same thing we did last week? So we'll see what we hear on that front. I think if I have Isaac Guerendo and he ends up being active tonight, I would go ahead and play him over Bucky Irving, but I would not play him over Rachaad White. What do you think between those decisions?
I would definitely play Guerendo over Bucky Irving if that's my choice. Guerendo versus Rachaad White is super tough. If Bucky Irving's out, Rachaad White is a top 20 running back play this week. But if Irving's in, then I think, White kind of drops into the RB3 flex range. So I guess right now, assuming Guerendo's active, if I was really choosing between Guerendo and Rachaad White, I'd probably lean towards Isaac Guerendo.
I mean, I think both Bucs running backs can finish top 24 in this matchup that should favor them trying to use those running backs. We've seen both of them get plenty of touches together. And I would think even an active Bucky Irving is probably not getting as much work as he got against Carolina the last time he was supposedly totally healthy. So if you are making decisions, there is upside certainly to Rachaad White, even if Bucky Irving plays. And check the Shark Bite section, our fantasy football news throughout the week, because every time we hear stuff that, signals one way or the other on these players, we'll toss it in there and try to make sure that you're as up to date as possible. George Pickens is dealing with the hamstring injury that cost him last week's game. Mike Tomlin said early in the week that he's basically doubtful, but there's an outside chance that Pickens can play this weekend. Obviously, another one we'll have to watch and see. I would go through the week assuming that George Pickens is not going to play against the Eagles, though.
I mean, this has been reported as a grade 2 hamstring, and there's, 3 grades, grade 1, 2, and 3. So it's in the middle. So it's not the most severe, but it's also not a minor hamstring. What I've read is that grade 2s tend to cost guys 3 to 6 weeks. To me, and remember, Pickens got hurt this past Friday, 6 days ago as of now. So he's not even a week removed yet. Week 16 is the bigger question for me. I'd be surprised if it truly is a grade 2. I'd be surprised if he plays this week. And I think he's, probably iffy even for week 16. So for now, for week 15, I would definitely plan on not having George Pickens available.
And obviously it not only affects him, but Russell Wilson without George Pickens last week threw for 158 yards, his fewest pass attempts in any game as a Steeler, and also just 6.1 yards per attempt. So it's not like, oh, he didn't throw enough to get yards. The yardage didn't come efficiently either. So Russell Wilson, you'll find way down our quarterback rankings for week 15 as well.
Yeah, Wilson's out of play. There's no Steelers wide receiver you can play. I believe Scotty Miller led the group in receiving yards last week. It was, kind of a rotation. Pat Freiermuth gets a boost with no Pickens, but it's also a bad matchup for him against Philly. So to me, the Steelers passing game is just hands off.
I was about to start Ray McLeod in one PPR league last week, and then I made a late switch to Calvin Austin after we heard George Pickens was out. Fortunately, it was a Josh Allen team, so it didn't end up mattering. I won big anyway, but man, I was kicking myself for that one as the day went on. Josh Downs, shoulder injury, missed the last game. That was before their week 14 bye, left week 12 early, limited Wednesday. What's the outlook on Josh Downs? What are we doing with him? if he does play in this Denver matchup.
And I'm expecting Downs to play. We're projecting him in as of now, but I would not want to use him in fantasy lineups. He's had a couple of big games with Anthony Richardson. So there's been 5 full Downs games with Richardson. He has wide receiver 6 and wide receiver 11 PPR finishes, but the other 3 have been wide receiver 72, wide receiver 98, and wide receiver 57. This to me seems more likely to be one of those floor games against Denver. The Broncos are actually down to 13th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. That's because the Jerry Jeudy game a couple of weeks back. Otherwise they've been tough against wide receivers. They're actually the 6th toughest matchup for slot receivers too, which is, where Downs is going to play. So really tough matchup for Downs. And as we said, we know what the floor is.
Yeah, we've had some games blowing up those matchup numbers lately. I noticed this week that the Bills matchup for wide receivers suddenly looks neutral just because of Puka and Cooper Kupp last week. Lad McConkey also did not play last week. He's dealing with sprains in a knee and a shoulder. He was limited in practice on Wednesday to start this week. That seems like a positive, but Lad McConkey was also limited in practice all 3 days last week. So we're going to still have to wait and see what's up with him. He at least was apparently a game time decision for the week 14 game. So you would like to think that a week later he's got a better shot to play, but we're just going to have to read what's being said about him leading up to what is a high upside matchup with the Bucs.
Probably not going to know for sure until Friday at the earliest. That's another later game, 4:25 kickoff. So that could be tricky. I do think, Josh Palmer, we saw him deliver last week as that primary slot receiver with Lad McConkey out. Even, Quentin Johnston, if you need a potential replacement for Lad if he does not play, I think those 2 Chargers are options as well as anyone else from these late games. Check their weekly rankings, check your My Team and Free Agent Finder for that stuff. If Lad plays, he would be very tough to sit, just how good he was over his really all season, but especially his last 3 healthy games. And then the Bucs, this is a nice matchup against Tampa. They are 24th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers.
Yeah, make sure to not only grab insurance, but check the start times on the games for those guys so that you can ideally get somebody who you could stick in if we find out during the early games on Sunday that Lad McConkey's not playing. Justin Herbert's also dealing with injury, sprained an ankle in last week's game. No practice for him on Wednesday. Jared, honestly, I wish that he had a worse matchup than Tampa Bay this week because I would love to just dump Justin Herbert down the rankings and say don't use him this week. I'm wary of starting Justin Herbert over Jameis Winston, assuming that Herbert makes it back to practice and is okay for the game. We'll see about that aspect. But even an active Herbert, I'm wary of playing him over Jameis Winston this week, which is what currently our rankings say.
Yeah, we'll see how Herbert progresses throughout the week. I'm assuming he's on the injury report with both an ankle and a quad. I think those injuries happened on that. It was a play near the end of the first half of that Chiefs game, and Herbert ended up missing the final snap of that series, but then coming in the next time the Chargers had the ball and playing the rest of the game. So expecting him to play, I think the bigger question is, will his mobility be limited? Will his rushing be limited? Because that's been a pretty big part of his fantasy production. He wasn't doing that early in the season when he was playing through an ankle injury. Harbaugh did say that this is not the same ankle injury, and he kind of alluded to it being more minor. So we'll see how he progresses throughout the week. I mean, like you said, Matt, it's an awesome matchup. The Bucs are actually now down to dead last in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They're going to be without Antoine Winfield in this game. The Chargers are at home. Don't got to worry about weather in this game. So it is a really nice spot for Herbert. And that's why he sits where he does in our rankings right now. But if he remains limited in practice, doesn't practice, and we think he's not going to be at 100% for this game, I could definitely see moving him down a few spots.
Yeah, and that said, if he's back to a full practice on Friday, then maybe he's fine where he is. Every time I see an update, I'm like, ooh, the ankle. He was rough the last time with the injury. Yeah. Maybe we should move him down. I'm like, oh, crap, he's playing the Bucs. I don't know how much I can push him down. So we'll see. It'll be one to watch throughout the week. We'll close out the injuries with tight end. Zach Ertz has a hamstring issue that he's dealing with. It was limited Wednesday, though, so it doesn't really seem like anything that's going to limit his availability for the game. I kept this on the list primarily because I think it's funny when teams list a guy with an injury and also not injury related. Like, which is it? If he has a hamstring, then put that on there. If the hamstring is not a thing, then put not injury related. Those two things should not be on the same report.
Yeah, that needs to be banned. Goodell needs to get on that immediately. Doesn't make any sense. I think this is a 34-year-old tight end getting some rest early in the week. I think Ertz will be fine for Sunday, and really a nice fantasy play. His volume has been very solid lately, and the Commanders shouldn't have trouble putting up points against the Saints.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I care a lot more about the veracity of the injury reports than I do about them playing football games in Berlin.
Yeah, agreed.
Dalton Kincaid, last tight end we'll talk about. Knee injury kept him out the past couple. Full practice Wednesday, so he seems to be on track to play. Not anybody I've been excited about at any point this season, though. What about you, Jared?
Yeah, I think you try not to use Kincaid this week. It's been an underwhelming season. He's coming off a 4-week absence with this knee injury, and he gets the Lions, who are first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. And I was kind of looking through the tight ends they faced. They faced some good fantasy producers this season. They totally blanked Kate Otten early in the year. Trey McBride caught just 3 balls for 25 yards against them. Jake Ferguson, 3 catches, 11 yards. Tucker Kraft scored last week against Detroit, but that was just the second tight end touchdown they've allowed all season. So even if Kincaid was at 100%, he'd, I think be a fringy tight end 1 this week. And I think it's very possible he's at least somewhat limited in his first game back here.
Certainly check our rankings throughout the week to see exactly where Kincaid settles in and who might make more sense. And of course, tracking all of these injury situations that could move guys up or down or out of the rankings as the week progresses. Let's move away from the injured guys now, talk about guys that we can at least be reasonably sure that they're going to play, barring some new injury within practice this week. Talked about Breece Hall in the backfield, but the Jets passing game is also interesting this week, coming off a good outing last week. And now they get Jacksonville, especially with Breece Hall out. You don't want to over-like Aaron Rodgers and his receivers, but it's really tough not to like that group for this matchup, for the situation this week.
Yeah, I mean, the receivers, Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson, they're in fantasy lineups. They probably have been for you anyways, but especially in this spot. I mean, we have them both as top 10 wide receiver plays this week. I bet both their receiving yardage overs, going to be considering them in DFS. Devontae Adams has averaged 10.8 targets per game over his last 5. He's actually third among receivers in expected PPR points per game over the last 5. And Garrett Wilson has 10 targets in 2 straight games. He has 8+ targets in 6 of the 7 games with Devontae Adams. So this has been a pass-leaning offense all season. It's a super concentrated passing game between those 2 guys. So they're both really strong options this week. Rodgers is the tricky one. He's been disappointing all season. You don't want to over trust him coming off really one of his only good games of the year this past week, but it was a good game. It was a productive game. It was, to me, as good as Rodgers has looked all season. It was actually his second best PFF passing grade of the year. It came against a Dolphins pass defense that had been good lately. Now he gets the Jaguars. They are 31st in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. That's all the good stuff for Rodgers. The stuff to be wary of, I mean, beyond the fact that he's disappointed for most of the season, Jacksonville is actually middle of the pack against quarterbacks over the last 5 weeks. They haven't been as bad lately as they were for most of the season. And then the Jets are only implied for 21.5 points. That's surprisingly low to me. Like I would bet on them beating that number, but it's definitely worth taking into consideration. The odds makers are not fully buying into this Jets offense despite what they did last week.
I think that's a good leveler. Like, it's okay to like Aaron Rodgers this week. Stop short of getting excited about Aaron Rodgers this week. If you've been getting it done with like Matthew Stafford at quarterback or CJ Stroud, Jordan Love, Jared Goff, Drake May, I would play Aaron Rodgers over those guys, but I'm not reaching for Aaron Rodgers because of the matchup over guys like Kyler Murray, Jalen Hurts, Brock Purdy.
Yeah, I mean, Sam Darnold, too. I would throw those guys into that list even of guys I would definitely start over Rodgers.
Oh, we'll talk more about those guys in a few minutes. Elsewhere at wide receiver, you already mentioned the easy starts of Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson. Any surprise guys that you're throwing in at wide receiver this week or that you like?
Yeah, I want to highlight a couple of Browns wide receivers. The first, Cedric Tillman, who got back to a limited practice on Wednesday. So he's been slowly working through the concussion protocol, but he's making progress now. It seems like he has a chance to play this weekend. And if he is clear, like he should be back to a full-time role in this Browns passing game. We know there's going to be volume here. They're underdogs to the Chiefs. I mean, I think there's a good chance we get 40+ attempts again from Jameis Winston. This Chiefs pass defense has not been that good. They've really been a pretty average pass defense over the second half of the season. And remember, Cedric Tillman in his 4 full games, 3 of those with Jameis Winston for the whole thing, averaged 10 targets across those 4 games, 6 catches, 76 receiving yards. He was a top 15 PPR wide receiver in the first 3 of those 4 games. So I think he's, right back in play as a wide receiver 3 if he's back this week. I like Elijah Moore as well. He actually has the best matchup among these Browns wide receivers in the slot against the Chiefs. Moore has been up and down with Jameis Winston so far, but he does have 8+ targets in 4 of Jameis's 6 starts. So again, I think he's a good volume bet in a good matchup. I think Elijah Moore is someone to consider, especially in full PPR.
And when he didn't get the targets, it was the games against Pittsburgh. You mentioned that this team being a good bet for more than 40 pass attempts. Jameis Winston has started 6 games for the Browns. The only game in which he did not attempt at least 41 passes was the snow game against Pittsburgh. He's averaging 43.2 attempts overall in his starts. Without that Pittsburgh game, he's averaging 46.4. Now, you've also got the high-end outlier, 58 attempts at Denver, but that's actually closer to his average than the low game against Pittsburgh was. So this is a high volume passing offense. I agree on Elijah Moore. I think that where we currently have him in the rankings, that's going to prove to be too low because he's in wide receiver 4 territory. I like Elijah Moore as a PPR wide receiver 3 this week. Jared, you mentioned in the Matchups That Matter article, this is the second fastest paced projected game. We've got 2 faster moving offenses in terms of time per play. We've got a high volume pass offense on the Cleveland side. You know, I think it's fine to be wary of Jameis Winston, and I don't want to put him too high in the QB rankings because he could still have that implosion game at any point, like he did earlier this year against the Chargers. Like he half had that against Denver, which helped propel his passing volume in that game. But his wide receivers, I think, are pretty safe bets for target volume this weekend, and all 3 of them, because we've seen all 3 of them work on target volume simultaneously, especially if David Njoku's hamstring injury keeps him out of this game. That's only going to help the target volume further for these guys.
For sure. Yeah. Good point about the 2 fast-paced offenses. They're also 2 of the pass-heaviest offenses in the NFL, especially lately. You know, the Chiefs have shifted in that direction. So yeah, I just like this game in general. And I do think, you know, Winston's a he's a safer fantasy bet than you might think. Cause like, even if he turns the ball over, that just kind of pushes him to even more passing volume.
I think I would probably play him over Aaron Rodgers, which is different than what's sitting in our rankings right now. But I think they are similar floor bets. And I don't think Aaron Rodgers comes close to the ceiling on Winston that we've seen this year.
Yeah, that's fair.
Any surprise sits at wide receiver on the other side? Any guys that look like starters, but that you don't actually want to play this week?
I mean, I think you got to at least consider benching Jaden Reed, and caveat here being, I think I've gotten Jaden Reed right exactly 0 times this season. The volume hasn't been great all year. I mean, he's at a 17% target share on the season. That's dropped to 15% over the last 5 games. And then within that same sample, you know, the last 5-6 games, the Packers just aren't throwing the ball. Jordan Love's averaging 24.8 pass attempts per game over his last 6. He has 23 or fewer pass attempts in 4 of those 6. This has just become one of the run heavier offenses in the NFL. So you couple that with a guy getting a mediocre target share, like Jaden Reed, he has to break a big play to pay off. And that's just kind of not the guy I want to be relying on at this point of the season.
He's short range Marquez Valdez-Scantling with more receiving talent around him. If you covered up the name and just looked at the numbers, you'd be like, I'm not playing this guy. Look at him. He has to get totally lucky to score a touchdown. So sometimes you need to do that, is cover up the name. Obviously, Jaden Reed is more talented than a lot of other guys that, you know, have that string of numbers, but you just can't ignore the way things are going when you're making your lineup decisions, especially this time of year. So I agree. I would prefer not to play Jaden Reed this week. I'm also wary of Brian Thomas Jr. with the Jets secondary getting healthy, especially. Sauce Gardner put in a full practice on Wednesday. He missed last week's game. Looks like he's going to be back for this one. DJ Reed's healthy on the other side. Michael Carter in the slot has only allowed 8.3 yards per catch and a 78.3 passer rating on throws in his range. Brian Thomas is primarily an outside guy, but has played about a third of the time in the slot. So, you know, a lot of times you can be like, yeah, he'll get away from Sauce Gardner in there at times, but it's not like there's relief in there. And on the other side, it's not like the Jets have a whole lot to worry about besides Brian Thomas Jr. So I think he's an okay volume bet where I'm not going out of my way to find a replacement for Brian Thomas Jr. But if I'm deciding between him and like Elijah Moore and Cedric Tillman down at the bottom of the wide receiver 3 rankings, I'm going to go ahead and take a shot on the Browns because I think there's more upside to go after there than there is with Brian Thomas Jr. in Jacksonville.
Yeah, again, I love the Browns. I don't know if I could do either of those guys over time. The thing with Thomas is he's seen 22 targets on a 30% target share over the last 2 weeks. I get the matchup's bad. I get it's Mac Jones, but Thomas he's really freaking good. And if he's going to get anywhere, and Doug Peterson has talked this week about needing to get him involved more because Thomas I believe he had no catches in the first half of last week's game, which just, can't happen. So I think there might be even more of an emphasis on getting him the ball this week. So at some point, I'm just willing to, bet on a talented receiver who I think is a pretty good bet for 8 to 12 targets this week.
Yep, that's fair too. He is 11 catches short, I believe, of the Jacksonville rookie record for receptions in a season. Doug Peterson said this week that it would be a nice bright spot for this season to get him that record. So I certainly think they'll try to get him the ball. I think there's a chance that they just can't do so this week. But, that's all this range of outcomes, and you got to decide where you feel good about betting on within that range. Speaking of the range of outcomes, we've got the Steelers and the Eagles this week in probably the most interesting game of the week. Regardless of how you feel about either team, its impact on the potential fantasy numbers, especially on the Philly side, and especially considering how the Eagles have been producing lately. It's also interesting to note, Jared, I wouldn't have guessed this, but I saw in your matchups article that it's the second lowest Vegas game total of the week. So even Vegas is like, don't expect shootout conditions here. So are we worried about the fantasy production, especially on the Eagles side? I think we've already talked about the Steelers passing game. We know it's a limited spot for Steelers running backs. Are we concerned about Eagles fantasy production?
Definitely not a shootout here. I would not expect that. It's the Steelers side dragging down that game total. The Steelers are implied for 18.5 points. That's the fifth lowest of the week. The Eagles still have a 24-point implied total. That's 2 or 3 points lower than we might see on average around their upper end of their range, but it's still a solid total. So Saquon Barkley obviously remains a must start. I think AJ Brown is a guy some people might be wondering about. I mean, obviously his volume has not been there lately, and it's not a target share thing. Like, he's still been pretty consistently in the 30 to 33% target share range most of these games. Just the Eagles aren't throwing a whole lot, and that's probably not going to change. There is some of the squeaky wheel stuff going on with AJB. He has kind of complained about his role. Kellen Moore has said this week that he wants to get Brown going. So I would expect him to, get his 7-8 targets in this game, even if the Eagles only throw it, 22 times. So I would lean towards sticking with AJ Brown. And then I think Jalen Hurts is the other guy. Jalen Hurts has been a top 10 fantasy quarterback in 9 of 13 games this season, but 3 of the 4 times he's finished outside the top 10 have come over the last 4 weeks. So he's been underwhelming lately. It's obviously not a great matchup. I do think, though, that Eagles' running game is going to be just fine in the spot. The Steelers are only 14th in run defense DVOA. And, of course, Jalen Hurts, I think, is going to be a pretty big part of that rushing attack.
It's not only a bad matchup, it is the worst QB scoring matchup in the league. We already saw Lamar Jackson have his worst fantasy outing of the season against Pittsburgh. Not a terrible outing by other people's standards, but his worst of the season in week 11 against Pittsburgh. Jaden Daniels, his team scored 27 points against the Steelers. He still had his worst fantasy outing of any game that he actually finished this year. 50% completions, 5 rushing yards. They allowed 1 rushing yard to Daniel Jones when they played the Giants. The Steelers have allowed the 3rd fewest QB rushing yards for the season. They faced the 7th most passing attempts, but also the fewest QB rushing attempts. That to me says it's a defense that's good at limiting scrambling by opponent quarterbacks, because we know that the pass rush is good. I think they're also well built to contain guys that can break out of that pocket and create yardage. We've, certainly seen some rushing success from Lamar Jackson and Anthony Richardson in just a little bit of time in that matchup against Pittsburgh. But overall, they've done a good job of containing that. Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, the only 2 quarterbacks to reach 20 fantasy points against Pittsburgh this year. And even Joe Burrow's 309 and 3 touchdowns, that's his worst fantasy outing among the past 5 games, that game against Pittsburgh. So even his good fantasy game was lower than his standards. Jameis Winston, 17.5 points per game in 2 meetings with the Steelers, fantasy-wise, 27.7 points in his other 4 games that were not against the Steelers. So I'm not saying all this to say bench Jalen Hurts. I'm not going out of my way to find a replacement, but I do think that Jalen Hurts is an example of where people can lean too heavily on the start your studs line and not enough on the make good 1-week decisions. So you mentioned the recent struggles for Jalen Hurts. That's included 179, 118, and 108 passing yards the past 3 weeks, the most recent against the Panthers. I mean, that should have been a dominating spot for everybody. Everybody should have scored as many points as they wanted in that game, and they didn't. Jalen Hurts is QB7 in fantasy points per game over the past 5 weeks. So even in spite of those struggles, he's still been good. He's currently 5th in our quarterback rankings for week 15. He's ahead of Brock Purdy, Sam Darnold, Tua Tagovailoa, and Kyler Murray. And I mentioned those guys because I think that they're all similar. You can look at the numbers and see that they're all close in projection. I think Jalen Hurts has the most downside risk among those 5 players this week. And I am probably playing Tua, I think, is the only one of those that I can't get comfy with playing over Jalen Hurts. I think the other three, I'm going to go ahead and play him.
Yeah, so the guys ahead of Hurts in our rankings, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, you don't have those guys with Hurts. Joe Burrow and Jaden Daniels are ahead of Jalen Hurts. There's a chance you have, especially Hurts and Daniels. I think in that case, I would play Daniels over Hurts this week pretty easily. Brock Purdy, I can definitely see playing over Jalen Hurts. He's healthy again. He's at home against a bad Rams defense tonight. I could definitely see that. Sam Darnold would not be crazy. He's rolling the Bears. The Bears still shows a negative matchup for us. That's not been a good pass defense for a while now. The Vikings are at home. Don't have to worry about weather on Monday night. So I think Darnold, you could consider over Hurts. Beyond that, though, I don't think I could bench Hurts for anyone beneath him in the rankings.
Darnold, I want to focus on a little bit just because I've had two separate people ask this week, should I start Sam Darnold over Jalen Hurts or am I crazy? And, your initial reaction is, yeah, it's crazy because you think of the history of Jalen Hurts and Sam Darnold, but you're not starting, all-time Sam Darnold this week. You're starting 2024 Sam Darnold, who has been good. We're talking about him versus Jalen Hurts is the QB4 in fantasy points for the season versus the QB7. So it's good versus good. It's not stud versus this guy who's a bust. Sam Darnold did throw for 330 and 2 touchdowns against the Bears just 3 weeks ago. His 2 games since, 235 and 2 against Arizona, 347 and 5 touchdowns against Atlanta last week. He's had 2+ touchdown passes in 4 straight games, in 6 of his past 7, in 10 of 13 for the season. So all that said, obviously Jalen Hurts could outscore Sam Darnold this week, but if you play Sam Darnold and Jalen Hurts scores more points on your bench, I don't think it would be an example of I screwed this up by not playing my stud. I think you played a guy that made sense and it didn't work out.
Yeah, for sure. I think Darnold over Hurts is viable. To me, the downside with Darnold is just that the Bears are still worse against the run in the past. We've seen a lot of games this season where, the Vikings just kind of control the game, control it with the run game. Darnold only throws it 28 times. I think, that's a downside. I think he's going to be efficient at home against that Bears defense. It's kind of just, does he get the volume and do the touchdowns go his way? I think that's where you feel better about Jalen Hurts. That you think, he's just a better bet to get more of the Eagles' total touchdowns because of his role at the goal line.
I would say a slightly better bet for that because there's a lot better passing scoring efficiency on the Minnesota side. And I mean, just the 2 matchups, Pittsburgh's just well set up to limit whatever the Eagles want to do, because I mentioned the scrambling stuff and just a good defense in general, but Philly's also a very shallow pass offense, especially with Dallas Goedert out. There's AJ Brown, there's Devontae Smith. And if you're able to halt either of those guys, it's all of a sudden not a very good pass offense.
Yep, very true.
All right, we'll move on from the quarterback question. You can see if our QB rankings alter all throughout the week. But now to running back, where there's another stud that, has some new questions this week. It's Alvin Kamara with the Saints without Derek Carr. And Jared, in 3 games without Derek Carr this year, he's averaged 70 total yards per game versus 121.3 total yards per game in 10 contests with Derek Carr. His fantasy points has still been good, 14.7 PPR points per game in those 3 without Carr, thanks to the receiving volume primarily. That'd be RB17 for the season. So that's definitely still a very useful player. It's much lower than his RB3 scoring average in games that Derek Carr at least started the season. Are you worried about Alvin Kamara this week? Where are you ranking him? Anybody surprising that you would start over him?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to be worried because of the downgrade at quarterback. You look at the Saints implied total, it's one of the lowest of the week. I think Kendre Miller at this point is at least some threat to Kamara, at least in terms of rushing volume. I mean, the one thing that makes him tough to sit, especially in full PPR, is just the target volume he's seen all season. And in those 3 non-Derek Carr games, Kamara averaged 8.7 targets per game. He had 8 targets, 7 targets, and 11 targets in those 3 games. I didn't even look if Taysom Hill and or Chris Olave played in those games, but they're both obviously out this week. So I just think Kamara is a good enough target bet to probably stay in at least full PPR lineups. You downgrade him to more of an RB2 this week, but I think in most cases he's still going to be in there just because he's probably going to give you like 8 to 10 points just with the passing game production alone.
Yeah, he's down to RB14 in our PPR rankings, which is very low versus how he has performed most of the season. He hasn't scored a touchdown, by the way, since week 6. I didn't even realize that until I was looking at his numbers for this. But like you said, the receiving volume makes him basically a must for PPR. He actually averaged 1 more reception per game in those no Derek Carr games than with Derek Carr on the field, which was also a bit surprising. Saints carry the 2nd lowest implied total of the week. So if it's outside of full PPR, I would seriously consider whether I have a better option than Alvin Kamara, especially if it's non-PPR. But if we're talking full PPR scoring, I'd have to have some pretty strong options to sit Kamara.
Yep, agreed.
By the way, he did miss practice Wednesday with an illness. Those tend to sort themselves out before the weekend, but that'll be a situation to watch. Now, on the other side of that matchup, we have Brian Robinson Jr., who has carried 16 times in 3 of his past 4 games. And the only time he didn't was a game he left early with an ankle injury, returned this past week from that, had 16 carries again, not even on the injury report this week. So how much do we like Brian Robinson in this matchup against New Orleans?
I mean, I think as much as you could ever like Brian Robinson, the spot doesn't get much better than this. Still no Austin Eckler. Commanders are 7.5 point favorites this weekend with a 25.5 implied total against the bad Saints run defense. If you look at the 6 healthy games that Brian Robinson played and Washington won, which we would expect them to do this week, Robinson averaged 16.3 carries, 84 rushing yards, and 0.7 rushing touchdowns per game. I think that's a pretty good baseline projection for him this week. I think he's a really nice RB2 play.
Yeah, I have him in one league where I also have Breece Hall and I have Jonathan Taylor, and I thought I was going to be all set at running back all season, but I think Brian Robinson Jr. is probably starting for that team this week. It's easy to like Brian Robinson this week. He's one of those guys that could just score twice and have, a bigger week than anybody's projecting for him. Rico Dowdle, Jared, I still, every time I see him in the rankings, I'm like, Rico Dowdle's too high. But I will say, for my own sake, I have stopped myself from saying that out loud every time. And I realize that he's just a player I need to not say anything about because it's working out lately and the matchup's good again for him this week.
Yeah, matchup's good. The Panthers are still the worst running back defense in terms of adjusted points allowed. And then you look at the role Rico Dowdle's been playing lately. Over the last 3 games now, 70% of the offensive snaps, 19.7 carries per game, 2.7 targets per game. He's 16th among running backs in expected PPR points per game over that span, 13th in actual PPR points per game. So I think he's a pretty rock solid RB2 play at this point.
I agree. I don't want it to be the case when I look at the name and where he's ranked, but it's true. And then let's close it out with tight end because we talked about some tight end injury situations above. I neglected to include David Njoku in that section, but we hit on him briefly. He's got a hamstring injury that we're going to have to watch this week. So people might be in need at tight end. Any sneaky / upside starters available at tight end? I want to mention Zach Ertz real quick. I know that he's probably not on a lot of waiver wires, but I know he's on some, especially outside of full PPR. And I think he's probably a better start than you think he is. 9 of 13 weeks have found him among the top 16 PPR tight ends, 7 of those inside the top 12, top 15 each of the past 3 weeks. He's tight end 9 in expected PPR points per game on the season, and just tight end 13 in the PPR version of the Fantasy Pros consensus rankings this week. So I think still just an undervalued guy. Nobody gets excited, but at some level you have to be like, he's not exciting, but I don't need an exciting guy in every spot in my lineup. I just need somewhere. I just need somebody who can steadily get me receptions.
Yeah, and Noah Brown out now for Washington. Noah Brown's kind of been right there with Terry McLaurin and Zach Ertz as the top 3 targets on this team. So he leaves behind quite a bit of opportunity. So Ertz could pick up some more volume this week again. We expect Washington to kind of do whatever they want against that Saints defense. So I like that call more than my guy. I have Jake Ferguson here as an option. He's available in 30% of Yahoo and Sleeper League. So it might be available in your league. Just 3 catches for 32 yards in his return last week, but he had 6 targets. That was second on the team, a 19% target share. Ran a pass route on 80% of pass plays. That's a good number for a tight end. Ferguson was back in a full-time role as the Cowboys lead tight end, and he gets this Carolina defense on Sunday. They're 31st in adjusted points allowed to tight end. So I think Ferguson is a fine, not exciting, but he's a fine low-end tight end 1 play.
I think somebody else who's uncomfortable and is going to be available in a lot of places is Pat Freiermuth. 17th among tight ends in route share since Russell Wilson stepped in. That's not a good number. I mean, it's not an awful number. So it puts him kind of in contention for playing time. 4 catches per game and 3 losses. That's a small sample because they just haven't lost a whole lot, but there has been some elevated volume. That's, of course, split across the 2 quarterbacks. Now, the Eagles have actually allowed tight end touchdowns in 3 of the past 4 games. That's a little bit of a cherry picking stat. Obviously, last week we had a Tommy Tremble touchdown on his only catch. We're not betting on that kind of week for anybody, but that 3-game span also included 8 catches for Washington tight ends against Philly, 11 catches for Ravens tight ends against Philly. I think Pittsburgh is going to struggle to do a lot in this game. We're both expecting George Pickens to be out. So if the Steelers fall behind and can't get the running game going, I wouldn't be surprised to see Pat Freiermuth get some elevated volume. And I think that's what we're looking for if you're scanning the wire for help. You're not looking for somebody who's going to help you because those guys are picked up. They're not available. You're looking for somebody who has a path to do so. I think Pat Freiermuth has that this week.
Yeah, I could see elevated volume. I mean, I don't think it's a good matchup for Freiermuth, but I know it's a really tough matchup for the Steelers, and that's just not a good wide receiver group. So I don't see them doing anything against that Eagles secondary. So that should definitely push more action Freiermuth's way. And I still think he's a good player. So I get it. I think he's a decent fallback option if you need it.
Yeah, it's like if you're squeezing a water balloon, from all sides, there's always that one little spot that pops up. Like that just could be the volume spot for Pat Freiermuth this week where all sides are getting squeezed. And it's like, oh, there's Pat Freiermuth. He's tall.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Exactly. Pay attention to Shark Bites this week. We will stay on top of all this news. We will update these guys. We will let you know what we know about these players. Check the rankings. And of course, check your team intel page for updated projections. We're going to keep moving these guys for whatever factors we think will affect the way that they produce in their games this week. We're going to try to help you build the best possible lineup for all your playoff matchups because we want Draft Sharks to be your unfair advantage.